How to know your vintage wines. Vintage, what exactly is that? Vintage is the time at which the year in which the grapes are picked. So if we pick the grapes this year, 2008, the vintage of the wine is 2008. Now, why does this matter? Vintage matters for a number of reasons. The simplest is just to know when to drink your wine. Every single wine is vintage. There's very few occasions when red wine or white wine is blended and there's no vintage. That often happens when you talk about table wines. However, every single wine beyond that will be vintaged. So here we've got, for example, a Bordeaux 2005, and this Bordeaux is a Graves. So how does this work with regards to the vintage? First thing I would say is that the grapes were harvested in year 2005, which actually happens to be a great vintage for Bordeaux, if not one of the best in 10-15 years. Now that you know what the vintage is, it determines what to do with your wine. Let's take a South of France wine with year 2005 on it. Now, these wines are often made to drink quite young, so you would know if you're the 2000, if you had the year 2000 vintage and now it's year 2008, that wine is almost past its drinking date. It's less fresh and less expressive and not at its best. So from here, you can determine that, from the vintage you can determine when to drink a wine. Also with a vintage, you can use this to determine how long to keep your wine. Bordeaux, typically Bordeaux and Burgundy wines, and some wines from the Piemonte region, Chianti, some of the Spanish wines, like Rioja Reservas, can be kept for 10, 15, and in some cases, like in Bordeaux, 20, 30 years. So if you've got a top-class Bordeaux, that's what we traditionally call a vintage wine. You can keep that to 15, maybe to 50 years, like a Mouton Rothschild. So if it's a 2005, you don't expect to drink it until maybe year 2020 and beyond for very expensive Bordeaux wine. However, an outlying Bordeaux wine from 2005, expect to drink it within the next 5 to 8 years. So use the vintage to determine at the time at which you can drink the wine. Also, vintages are what the writers talk about. Every vintage is affected by weather, basically by the climatic conditions. Some years are good years, some years are bad years. Where wines are to keep, it's important to know the vintage in which they were harvested. For example, again, coming to one of the great years, 2005, you're pretty safe across all of Bordeaux to keep that wine for anything from 5 to 50 years, depending on the quality of the estate. If it had been a bad year, let's say, as an example, off the top of my head, maybe 2003, Chianti is a bad year, then you know those wines were maybe exposed to a warmer climate, so there's less structure in them, so you'd have to actually drink them quite young. So a connoisseur would know that, okay, that wine is drinkable, but we'll drink it young. We won't keep it, because if we keep it, it will have no structure, no fruit within 10 years' time, even 5 years' time. So vintage is a good reference point to show you when to drink a wine. That's the good definition for vintage. And then there's a vintage wine, which are wines which are high quality and are aged. So typically would say a vintage Mouton Rothschild. And there you're talking about a completely different issue. You're talking about a wine that's going to be laid down for a long time, where it's always called a vintage wine. And we use that as a way to distinguish it from an ordinary wine. When you're working with fine wine and ports, for example, or vintage ports, every port has a vintage, and all the fine wines have vintages on them. To find those vintage information, go to vintage tables that tell you the conditions under which the wines were harvested, whether they're going to be great wines or everyday wines. Most good quality websites will have a vintage chart on them, and good writers like Jancis Robinson, Hugh Johnson, English writers, have got vintage charts in their books. Use those as references as to when to drink wines and as to how to buy vintage wine. That's how you know your vintages.